Lisa had always known every face in Millbrook. Growing up in a town of barely 3,000 people meant that everyone knew everyone, and secrets were harder to keep than morning dew on Texas grass. She'd walked these same dusty streets as a little girl, graduated from Millbrook High with her class of 42 students, and returned after college to teach at the very elementary school where she'd once learned to read. At 28, Lisa thought she understood how her small town worked. People looked out for each other, helped during tough times, and mostly minded their own business. She'd built what she thought was a good life here, teaching second grade to kids whose parents she'd grown up with. Her little apartment above, the hardware store, was cozy, her students loved her, and she felt like she was making a real difference in their young lives. But everything changed on a Tuesday morning in October when she noticed something that would turn her world upside down. It started small, like most big problems do. Lisa was supervising recess when she saw Tommy Williams, one of her former students who was now in 8th grade, talking to some middle school kids by the fence. Something about the way they were acting made her pay attention. The hushed voices, the quick exchange of something from Tommy's backpack, and how the younger kids scattered when they saw her watching. Lisa's stomach dropped. She'd seen enough movies and read enough news stories to recognize what was happening. But this was Tommy Williams, the same boy who used to bring her drawings of dinosaurs and always said please and thank you. His father owned the biggest ranch outside town, and his family had lived in Millbrook for 4 generations. She couldn't ignore what she'd seen, even though every instinct told her to look the other way. These were kids, some barely 12 years old. If Tommy was selling drugs to them, she had to do something about it. The next few days were torture. Lisa watched Tommy more carefully and saw the same pattern. Quick meetings with younger students, small exchanges, money changing hands. Her heart broke a little more each time because she genuinely cared about Tommy and couldn't understand how he'd gotten involved in something like this. Finally, she made the hardest decision of her teaching career. She called the principal, Mrs. Henderson, and reported what she'd witnessed. Mrs. Henderson, who'd been running the school for 15 years, listened carefully and told Lisa she'd done the right thing. They would handle it quietly and get Tommy the help he needed. But nothing stayed quiet in Millbrook for long. Within hours of the principal calling Tommy's parents, Lisa's phone started ringing. The first call was from Tommy's mother, crying and asking how Lisa could make up such terrible lies about her son. The second was from Tommy's father, his voice cold and threatening as he accused Lisa of trying to destroy their family's reputation. By the end of the week, it felt like half the town had chosen sides, and most of them weren't on Lisa's side. The Williams family had deep roots and deeper pockets in Millbrook. Tommy's father, Big Jim Williams, sat on the school board and owned not just the largest ranch but also had investments in the bank, the feed store, and several other local businesses. His older brother was the sheriff, and his cousin ran the only newspaper in town. What should have been a straightforward investigation into a troubled teenager became something much uglier. The Williams family hired a lawyer from the county seat who argued that Lisa had no real evidence, just suspicions and assumptions. They painted her as a bitter single woman trying to get attention by attacking one of Millbrook's most respected families. The worst part was watching how quickly some people she'd known her whole life turned against her. Parents who'd smiled and waved at her in the grocery store now crossed the street to avoid her. Some pulled their children out of her classroom, claiming they couldn't trust someone who would make false accusations against a child. Lisa tried to stay strong, reminding herself that she'd done the right thing. But the isolation was crushing. Her landlord, who was friends with the Williams family, suggested she might be happier living somewhere else. The mechanic who'd always fixed her car suddenly couldn't find time in his schedule when she needed repairs. Even her hairdresser, who'd been cutting her hair since high school, acted cold and distant during what turned out to be their last appointment. The breaking point came 3 months later at the monthly town council meeting. Lisa had been avoiding public gatherings, but she needed to speak about the school budget since she was on the education committee. She thought people had maybe started to forget that the worst was over. She was wrong the moment she stood up to speak. She felt the weight of hostile eyes on her. Big Jim Williams was sitting in the front row with several other prominent families, and when Lisa began talking about funding for new textbooks, he stood up and interrupted her. "I think we need to talk about something more important than books," Big Jim said, his voice carrying easily through the small meeting room. "We need to talk about whether someone who makes false accusations against children should be making decisions about education in our town." The room erupted. People started talking over each other, some defending Lisa, but many more agreeing with Big Jim. The mayor tried to restore order, but the damage was done. Lisa stood at the front of the room, her prepared notes about textbook funding forgotten. While people she'd known her entire life debated whether she was trustworthy enough to teach their children. "She's always been a troublemaker," someone called out from the back. "Just wants attention since she can't find a husband." Another voice added, causing several people to laugh. Lisa felt her face burn with embarrassment and anger. These people had watched her grow up, had celebrated when she came back to teach in her hometown, had trusted her with their most precious possessions, their children. Now they were treating her like a stranger, like an enemy, when Big Jim demanded that she be removed from the education committee for the good of our children. And several people applauded. Lisa realized with crystal clarity that her life in Millbrook was over. She could keep fighting, keep trying to prove she'd been right about Tommy, but it would be a battle against an entire community that had already made up its mind. She gathered her papers with shaking hands and walked out of the meeting room while voices continued to argue behind her. Outside in the parking lot, under the same streetlights she'd grown up with, Lisa made a decision that would change everything. She couldn't stay in Millbrook anymore. The town that had raised her, that she'd thought would always be home, had made it clear she wasn't welcome. The job she loved was becoming impossible. The apartment she'd made cozy was now just a place where she hid from disapproving looks, and the life she'd built was crumbling around her. That night, Lisa sat in her apartment looking at the photo albums full of memories from a life that suddenly felt like it belonged to someone else. Every picture showed her surrounded by people who now saw her as the enemy. Every memory was tainted by the knowledge that the community she trusted had been so quick to turn on her. She opened her laptop and typed a simple resignation letter to the school board. Then she pulled out her suitcases and began packing the life she was about to leave behind forever. Lisa drove through the night with no real plan except to get as far away from Millbrook as possible. Her old Honda Civic was packed tight with everything that mattered, clothes stuffed into garbage bags, a box of her favorite books, her grandmother's quilt, and the ceramic mug her second graders had made for her last Christmas. Everything else she'd left behind, including the key to her apartment sitting on the kitchen counter like a period at the end of a sentence. The highway stretched endlessly ahead of her, lit only by her headlights cutting through the darkness. She'd never driven this far alone before, never been this far from home without knowing exactly when she'd return. The radio played softly, but she barely heard it over the sound of her own thoughts racing faster than the miles disappearing behind. Every few minutes, she'd glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the lights of Millbrook still glowing on the horizon. But there was only darkness now, and with each mile the weight in her chest grew heavier instead of lighter. She'd thought leaving would feel like freedom, but instead it felt like falling. By midnight, she'd driven past 3 small towns without stopping. Each one looked similar to Millbrook, with their single main streets and clusters of houses sleeping under streetlights. She wondered if those towns were different, if they'd treat a stranger with kindness instead of suspicion. But she couldn't bring herself to stop and find out. Not yet. The fuel gauge had been hovering near empty for the last 20 miles when she finally pulled into a gas station outside a place called Cedar Springs. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as she filled her tank, and the night air was colder than she'd expected. She bought a cup of coffee that tasted like it had been sitting on the burner since dinner time and a package of cookies that would serve as breakfast. Back on the road, Lisa tried to make sense of what had happened to her life. Just 12 hours ago, she'd been a teacher with an apartment and a routine and people who knew her name. Now, she was driving through the middle of nowhere with $800 in cash, and no idea where she'd sleep tomorrow night. The coffee helped keep her alert, but it couldn't stop the thoughts that kept circling back to the same painful questions. Had she been wrong to report Tommy? Should she have tried harder to talk to him first? Maybe if she'd handled things differently, she'd still have her job, her home, her life, but then she remembered the faces of those younger kids, barely out of elementary school, and she knew she'd had no choice. Someone had to protect them, even. If it cost her everything she'd worked for, the dashboard clock showed 2 in the morning. When she first noticed the temperature gauge creeping toward the red zone, Lisa's heart sank as she watched the needle climb higher with each passing mile. She'd learned enough about cars from her father to know this wasn't good. But she hoped maybe it was just the gauge acting up. The hope didn't last long. Steam started, seeping from under the hood, thin wisps at first, then thick white clouds that made it hard to see the road ahead. The engine began making a grinding noise that sounded expensive and final. Lisa eased off the gas and started looking for somewhere safe to pull over. But this stretch of Highway 90 was more desolate than anything she'd seen so far. Mile markers and fence posts flashed by in her headlights, but no buildings, no other cars, nothing that looked like help. The steam was getting thicker now, and the grinding noise was getting louder. She knew she was in trouble, finally. She spotted what looked like an old building in the distance and managed to coast into the parking lot just as the engine gave a final shudder and died. The sudden silence was almost as frightening as the noise had been. Lisa sat for a moment with her hands still gripping the steering wheel, trying to process what had just happened. The building in front of her turned out to be an abandoned diner, its windows dark and a for sale sign barely visible in the moonlight. She was miles from the nearest town, her phone showed no signal bars, and her car was definitely not going anywhere under its own power. She popped the hood and immediately stepped back as more steam poured out. Even in the dim light, she could see coolant pooled on the ground beneath the car. Her father had taught her to check oil and change a tire, but this was beyond anything she knew how to fix. Lisa walked around to the front of the car and sat on the hood, which was still warm from the overheated engine. The night was quiet except for the occasional sound of wind through the old diner's broken signs. Above her, more stars were visible than she'd ever seen from Millbrook, but their beauty felt cold and distant. This was when the full weight of her situation finally hit her. She had no home to go back to, no job waiting for her, and now no way to get wherever she was going. The $800 in her purse wouldn't last long, especially if she needed major car repairs. She had no family to call. Her parents had died in a car accident when she was in college, and she'd never had brothers or sisters to lean on. For the first time since leaving Millbrook, Lisa let herself really think about how alone she was. The anger that had sustained her through the confrontation at the town meeting was fading, replaced by something much scarier, fear. Overwhelming fear about what would happen to her next. The tears came suddenly and silently at first, then in great heaving sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her chest. She cried for the job she'd loved and lost, for the students she'd tried to protect, for the community that had turned its back on her. She cried for her parents, who weren't there to help her figure out what to do next. She cried for the future she'd planned that would never happen now, but mostly she cried because she felt so completely and utterly alone. The night air was getting colder, and Lisa realized she'd need to make some decisions soon. She could try walking to find help, but she had no idea how far it might be to the nearest house or business. She could wait until morning and hope someone would drive by, but this road didn't seem to get much traffic. She could try to sleep in the car, but the thought of spending the night alone in this empty place made her stomach clench with anxiety. She'd never felt so small and helpless in her entire life. In Millbrook, even during the worst of the conflict with the Williams family, she'd known the geography, known which neighbors might help and which stores stayed open late. Here, she knew nothing and no one. Lisa pulled her grandmother's quilt from the back seat and wrapped it around her shoulders. The familiar smell of lavender and old fabric was comforting, a reminder of better times when problems seemed smaller and solutions seemed possible. She sat on the hood of her broken car, surrounded by darkness and silence, and tried to figure out how to survive whatever came next. The minutes ticked by slowly. marked only by the occasional distant sound of what might have been a truck on some other highway far away. Each time she thought she heard an engine, her heart would jump with hope, but the sounds always faded without any headlights appearing on her road. As the night grew colder and deeper around her, Lisa realized that this moment, sitting alone on a broken car in the middle of nowhere, might be the lowest point of her entire life. Everything familiar was behind her, everything unknown stretched ahead, and she was stuck right here in between with nothing but her tears and the fading warmth of an engine that had given up just like everything else. Lisa had been sitting on her broken car for what felt like hours when she first heard the rumble of an engine in the distance. At first she thought it might be another phantom sound like the ones that had teased her hope earlier. But this one grew steadily louder, and soon she could see headlights cutting through the darkness about a mile down the highway. Her heart started racing. Part of her was desperate for help, but another part was suddenly terrified. Here she was, a woman alone, in the middle of nowhere at 2:30 in the morning, about to encounter a complete stranger. All the warnings her mother had given her about trusting people flashed through her mind. The vehicle slowed as it approached, and Lisa could see it was a pickup truck, the kind that working men drove. It pulled past her car, then stopped about 50 yards down the road. For a long moment, nothing happened. The truck just sat there with its engine running, and headlights pointed away from her. Lisa wrapped the quilt tighter around her shoulders and tried to decide what to do. Should she wave? Should she get in her car and lock the doors? Should she try to hide behind the abandoned diner? Then she heard a door slam shut and the sound of boots on gravel. Someone was walking toward her, but they were staying in the shadows between the streetlight and the truck's headlights. Lisa's mouth went dry, and she could feel her pulse hammering in her throat. "Ma'am?" The voice was deep but gentle, with the kind of slow drawl that suggested someone who didn't rush into conversations. "I don't mean to startle you, but I couldn't help noticing you seem to be having some car trouble." The man stepped into the circle of light cast by the old street lamp, and Lisa got her first look at him. He was tall and lean, probably in his early 40s, wearing jeans and a work shirt with the sleeves rolled up. His face was weathered in the way that came from spending time outdoors, and he had the kind of mustache that suggested he'd been growing it for years, not following some fashion trend. What struck Lisa most was how he held himself. His hands were visible at his sides, not in his pockets or behind his back. He'd stopped walking while he was still several feet away from her, far enough that she wouldn't feel cornered. Everything about his posture said he was trying not to seem threatening. "Yes, sir," Lisa managed to say, her voice smaller than she'd intended. "My engine overheated, I think. There's coolant all over the ground." The man nodded sympathetically. "That's a tough break, especially out here. Mind if I take a look? I'm not a mechanic, but I've kept enough old trucks running to know the basics." Lisa hesitated. Every instinct told her to be careful, but something about this stranger felt different from the angry faces she'd left behind in Millbrook. Maybe it was the way he'd asked permission before approaching her car, or the genuine concern in his voice. "I'd appreciate that," she said finally. The man walked over to her Honda and looked under the hood, using a small flashlight he'd pulled from his pocket. Lisa could hear him making soft clicking sounds with his tongue, the way her father used to do when he was thinking through a problem. "Well, the good news is you're not hurt," he said after a few minutes. "The bad news is your radiator's got a crack in it about the size of my thumb. This car's not going anywhere tonight, and probably not tomorrow either without some serious work." Lisa felt her stomach drop. She'd been hoping it might be something simple, something that could be fixed with a bottle of coolant from a gas station. "There's a mechanic shop in Cedar Springs about 15 miles back," the man continued, "but it won't be open until 8 in the morning, and even then, they might not have the parts in stock for a car this old." Lisa nodded, trying to keep her composure, but she could feel tears threatening again. The man must have noticed, because his voice got even gentler. "Look, I know this is none of my business, and you don't know me from Adam, but you can't stay out here all night. It gets cold in the desert, and this isn't exactly the safest place for someone to be stranded alone." "I'll be okay," Lisa said automatically. Though they both knew it wasn't true, the man was quiet for a moment, seeming to wrestle with something. Finally, he spoke again. "My name's Ben Morrison, and I've got a ranch about 20 minutes from here. I was just coming back from helping Doc Patterson with a difficult birth, Mari having trouble with her foal. Took most of the night, but we got them both through it." He paused, as if making sure she understood he had a legitimate reason for being on the road at this hour. "I've got a small guest cabin on my property," he continued. "Nothing fancy, but it's clean and warm, and it's got a lock on the door that works from the inside. You could stay there tonight, and in the morning I'll drive you into town to talk to Jimmy about fixing your car. No strings attached, no expectations. Just one person helping another who's had some bad luck." Lisa stared at him, trying to process what he was offering. A week ago, if someone had told her she'd be considering going to a stranger's ranch in the middle of the night, she'd have thought they were crazy. But a week ago, she'd had a home and a job and a life that made sense. "I don't have much money," she said quietly. "I couldn't pay you for the cabin." Ben shook his head. "I'm not asking for money. The cabin's been empty since my sister moved to Dallas 2 years ago. It's just sitting there. But why would you help someone you don't even know?" Ben was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the dark highway. "I guess because I know what it's like to need help and not have anywhere to turn. About 3 years back, I went through a rough patch myself. Lost my wife in a car accident, nearly lost the ranch because I couldn't focus on anything for months. People in town helped me get through it. People who didn't owe me anything but saw I was drowning and threw me a rope." He looked back at Lisa, and even in the dim light she could see something in his eyes that she recognized, the kind of pain that came from losing everything that mattered. "Maybe this is just my way of passing that kindness along," he said simply. Lisa found herself studying his face, looking for any sign of deception or hidden motives. But all she saw was a tired man who seemed genuinely concerned about a stranger's welfare. In the past 3 months, she'd become an expert at reading people's expressions, at spotting the moment when friendliness turned to suspicion or disgust. She didn't see any of that in Ben Morrison's face. "You said the cabin has a lock that works from the inside?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am. Deadbolt and a chain latch. And it's about 100 yards from the main house, so you'd have your privacy." Lisa looked at her broken car, then at the empty highway stretching in both directions, then at Ben's honest face. She thought about spending the night alone in her car, about trying to walk 15 miles in the dark, about all the things that could go wrong if she stayed here. "Okay," she said, surprising herself with the decision. "I'll take you up on that offer. But I want to pay you something, even if it's just for electricity and water." Ben smiled for the first time since he'd stopped, and it transformed his whole face. "We can work something out? Maybe you can help me organize my office. It's been a disaster since my bookkeeper retired last year." As Lisa gathered her most important belongings from the car, she realized that for the first time in months, someone was offering her help, without asking for anything in return, without judging her, without making her feel like a burden. It felt almost too good to be true, but as she climbed into the passenger seat of Ben's truck, Lisa decided that maybe, just maybe, her luck was finally starting to change. The drive to Ben's ranch took them through rolling hills that Lisa couldn't see much of in the darkness, but she could sense the vastness of the landscape around them. The truck's headlights caught glimpses of fence posts and cattle, and occasionally, the eyes of some night animal would reflect back at them from the roadside. Ben didn't try to fill the silence with small talk, which Lisa appreciated. She was exhausted from the day's events and still processing the fact that she was driving through the night with a complete stranger. But something about Ben's quiet presence was calming rather than threatening. He drove with the easy confidence of someone who traveled these roads thousands of times. When they finally turned onto a dirt road marked by a simple wooden sign that read Lazy M Ranch, Lisa felt a flutter of nervousness return. This was really happening. She was about to stay at a stranger's place, miles from anywhere, with no way to leave if things went wrong. The ranch house appeared first in the headlights, a modest single-story building with a wraparound porch and several rocking chairs. It looked lived in but well-maintained, with flower boxes under the windows and a wind chime hanging from the porch roof. "That's the main house," Ben explained as they drove past. "The cabin's just up ahead." The guest cabin was smaller than Lisa had expected, but it looked solid and welcoming. It was maybe 20 feet by 20 feet with a small porch of its own and windows on 3 sides. Ben parked the truck and helped Lisa carry her bags to the front door. "Let me show you around," he said, pulling out a key ring. "I keep it locked when nobody's staying here, but the key's always in the same place if you need to get out and I'm not around." Inside, the cabin was simple but comfortable. There was a double bed with a colorful quilt, a small kitchenette with a 2-burner stove and mini refrigerator, a table with 2 chairs, and a bathroom with a shower. Everything was clean and smelled faintly of pine cleaner. "I stocked the fridge with some basics last month when I thought my nephew might visit," Ben said, opening the refrigerator to show her milk, eggs, bread, and some sandwich meat. "Feel free to use whatever's here. There's coffee in the cabinet above the stove, and the water's good to drink straight from the tap." Lisa looked around the cabin and felt something she hadn't experienced in months, a sense of safety. The space felt protected somehow, like a cocoon where she could catch her breath and figure out what to do next. "This is perfect," she said, and meant it. "I can't thank you enough," Ben nodded toward the door. "Deadbolt and chain latch, like I promised. And there's my phone number on the pad by the phone if you need anything. I'm usually up by 5:30 for morning chores, but don't feel like you need to be. Sleep as long as you want." After Ben left, Lisa locked the door and sat on the bed, still hardly believing where she was. 12 hours ago, she'd been packing her car in Millbrook, angry and hurt and determined to leave. Now she was in a stranger's cabin, surrounded by quiet that felt peaceful instead of threatening. She made herself a cup of coffee and sat at the small table, looking out the window at the darkness. For the first time in months, she felt like she could breathe properly. There was no one watching her with suspicious eyes, no whispered conversations that stopped when she walked by, no feeling like she had to defend herself just for existing. That first night, Lisa slept better than she had since the trouble started in Millbrook. She woke to sunlight streaming through the windows and the sound of birds she didn't recognize. When she looked out, she could see the ranch spread out before her, rolling pastures dotted with cattle, a red barn in the distance, and Ben already at work near a corral with several horses. Lisa made breakfast with the supplies Ben had left, and found herself actually enjoying the simple meal. The eggs were fresh, probably from chickens on the ranch, and the coffee was strong and good. She hadn't realized how much stress had been affecting her appetite until she found herself eating with genuine hunger. Around 9 o'clock, Ben knocked on the cabin door. "Ready to go talk to Jimmy about your car?" he asked out the drive into Cedar Springs gave Lisa her first good look at the area in daylight. The landscape was beautiful in a stark way, wide open spaces under a sky that seemed bigger than any she'd ever seen. The town itself was small but appeared more prosperous than Millbrook, with several businesses along the main street and people going about their morning routines. Jimmy's garage was a small operation run by a man in his 60s who looked like he'd been fixing cars since he was a teenager. He listened to Lisa's description of what had happened and nodded knowingly. "Radiator's probably shot," he said. "These old Hondas are good cars, but when the cooling system goes, it usually goes all at once. I can take a look at it this afternoon if Ben can bring it in." "How much do you think it'll cost?" Lisa asked, trying to keep the worry out of her voice. Jimmy scratched his chin. "Hard to say without seeing it, but if it needs a new radiator, you're looking at maybe $400 for the part and another $150 for labor. Could be less if I can find a good used one." Lisa's heart sank. That was more than half her money, and she still needed to find somewhere to live and some way to make a living. Ben must have noticed her expression. "Don't worry about it right now," he said quietly. "Let's get the car looked at first, then figure out the rest." They arranged for Jimmy to tow the Honda from the highway, and Ben drove Lisa back to the ranch. On the way, he mentioned that he had some bookkeeping that needed to be done if she was interested in earning a little money while she waited for her car to be fixed. "I'm not much good with numbers," Ben admitted. My sister used to help me with the books when she lived here, but since she moved to Dallas, I've been making a mess of things. The tax accountant nearly had a heart attack when he saw my records last year. Lisa found herself smiling for the first time in days. I actually like working with numbers. I used to help my dad with his small business accounting when I was in high school. Really? Well, if you don't mind taking a look at the disaster I call my office, I'd be happy to pay you for the help. That afternoon, Ben showed Lisa to a small room off the main house that served as his office. It was chaos, receipts stuffed into shoeboxes, invoices stacked on every surface, and a computer that looked like it hadn't been used in months. But as Lisa looked through the mess, she realized it wasn't hopeless. Ben had kept everything. It just needed to be organized. "This isn't as bad as you think," she told him. "You've got all the information here, it just needs to be sorted and entered into a system." Over the next few days, while waiting for news about her car, Lisa threw herself into organizing Ben's books. She created spreadsheets on his computer, sorted receipts by date and category, and started making sense of the ranch's finances. To her surprise, she found the work satisfying in a way that teaching had never quite been. More than that, she discovered that Ben's ranch was actually doing better than he'd realized. His careful management of the cattle and his reputation for quality had built a solid business, but his poor record-keeping had hidden that success from him. "Look at this," Lisa said one evening, showing Ben a profit and loss statement she'd created. "You're making money, good money. You just didn't know it because everything was scattered." Ben stared at the numbers with amazement. "Are you sure about this? I mean, I know we're not losing money, but I had no idea we were doing this well." "You're doing more than well. You're building something solid here." As the days passed, Lisa found herself settling into a rhythm. She'd wake up early, make coffee, and spend the morning working on Ben's books. In the afternoons, she'd help with small tasks around the ranch, feeding chickens, organizing the tack room, or simply sitting on the porch watching the cattle graze. The work was different from teaching, but it was satisfying in its own way. She was creating order from chaos, helping Ben understand his own business better, and for the first time in months, she felt useful rather than burdensome. Ben, meanwhile, seemed to appreciate having someone around who understood both numbers and hard work. He'd explain the ranching business to her over dinner, and she'd share ideas about how to track expenses more efficiently or plan for seasonal changes in income. "You know," Ben said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, "I haven't had anyone to talk to about the business side of things since my sister moved away. It's nice to have someone who understands what I'm trying to do here." Lisa realized that she hadn't thought about Millbrook or the Williams family in days. The anger and hurt were still there, but they seemed less important now, overshadowed by the satisfaction of building something new. 3 months had passed since that night when Lisa's car broke down on the highway, and she could barely recognize the person she'd become. The woman who had fled Millbrook in tears felt like a stranger now, someone from a different life entirely. Every morning, she woke up in the little cabin that had become more home to her than anywhere she'd ever lived. And every morning, she felt grateful for the chance to start fresh. Her car had been fixed weeks ago. Jimmy had found a good used radiator and gotten the Honda running like new for $350, which was less than she'd feared. The car now sat in the driveway of the cabin, keys hanging on a hook by the door, ready to take her anywhere she wanted to go. But every day, Lisa found new reasons to stay. The ranch books were not only organized now, but running like clockwork. She'd set up a simple system that let Ben track everything from feed costs to veterinary bills to the price he got for cattle at market. For the first time in years, he knew exactly how his business was doing at any given moment. More than that, Lisa had discovered she had a real talent for the financial side of ranching. She understood the seasonal patterns, the way expenses peaked during calving season and income surged when cattle went to market. She could spot trends that Ben missed and suggest changes that saved money or brought in more profit. "You know what you've done here?" Ben said one morning, looking at the monthly report Lisa had prepared. "You've made me feel like a real businessman, instead of just a guy who happens to own some cows." Lisa laughed, but she knew what he meant. There was something satisfying about taking raw numbers and turning them into useful information, about seeing the whole picture of how a business worked instead of just the day-to-day tasks. The work had given her confidence back, but it was more than that. She felt needed here in a way she'd never felt needed in Millbrook. In town, she'd been replaceable, just another teacher who could be pushed aside when she became inconvenient. Here, she was building something alongside Ben, contributing to something that mattered. The relationship between them had grown slowly and naturally. They'd started as strangers helping each other through difficult times, but gradually became partners in running the ranch. Ben would ask her opinion on everything from which feed supplier to use to whether it made sense to buy more pasture land. Lisa found herself thinking about the ranch's future as much as its present. She'd also discovered she enjoyed the physical work of ranch life. She'd learned to drive the tractor, help with feeding, and even assist with basic veterinary care. Her hands, which had once been soft from years of teaching, were now calloused from real work, and she wore those calluses with pride. But the biggest change was in how she felt about herself. In Millbrook, she'd started to believe what people said about her, that she was a troublemaker, someone who couldn't be trusted, someone who didn't belong. Here, she was valued for her mind, her work ethic, and her loyalty. Ben never questioned her judgment or made her feel like she had to prove herself over and over. The turning point came on a Tuesday morning when Ben's neighbor, an older rancher named Charlie, stopped by to ask for help. "I heard you've been working on Ben's books," Charlie said, twisting his hat in his hands. "I'm wondering if you might take a look at mine. I'm in a real mess with the tax people, and I don't know where to turn." Lisa looked at Ben, who nodded encouragingly. "I'd be happy to help," she said. Charlie's books were in even worse shape than Ben's had been. But Lisa could see the problem wasn't just poor record-keeping. Charlie was being charged too much for feed, paying penalties he didn't need to pay, and missing out on tax benefits he was entitled to. Within a week, she'd saved him nearly $2,000 and set up a system to prevent future problems. Word spread quickly through the ranching community. These were people who worked hard for their money and didn't waste it on unnecessary expenses, but many of them were struggling with the business side of their operations. They could manage cattle and fix equipment and work 18-hour days during calving season, but they got overwhelmed by spreadsheets and tax forms. Soon, Lisa was getting calls from ranchers all over the county. Some needed help organizing their books, others wanted advice on financing equipment purchases or planning for retirement. She found herself driving from ranch to ranch, helping people who reminded her of her own father, hardworking folks who were good at what they did but needed help with the parts of business that felt foreign to them. "I think you found your calling," Ben said one evening as Lisa told him about her day helping a young couple buy their first ranch. "You're like a translator between the ranchers and the business world." Lisa realized he was right. This work combined everything she was good at, explaining complicated things in simple terms, helping people solve problems, and fighting for people who needed an advocate. It was teaching in a way, but teaching adults who wanted to learn rather than children who had to be there. 3 months after that first request from Charlie, Lisa had more clients than she could handle. She was making good money, enough to pay Ben rent for the cabin and still save for the future. More importantly, she was doing work that mattered, helping people keep their family businesses running, but the success brought a decision she'd been avoiding. Ben had been careful never to pressure her to stay, never to make her feel trapped by obligation or expectation. He'd always treated her presence as temporary, even as temporary stretched into months. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the cattle settle down for the night, Ben brought up what they'd both been thinking about. "You know, you're welcome to stay here as long as you want," he said quietly. "But I've been wondering if you might want to make it more official. Maybe think about this as your permanent home instead of just a place you're staying." Lisa had been expecting this conversation, but it still made her heart race. "What do you mean by official?" "I mean, maybe it's time to stop pretending this is temporary. You've built a business here, and I've gotten used to having you around. More than used to it, if I'm being honest." Lisa looked at him in the fading light. Over the months, she'd come to care about Ben in a way that went beyond friendship. Or business partnership? He was a good man who'd offered her shelter when she had nowhere else to go, and then given her the space to rebuild her life on her own terms. He'd never pushed for more than she was ready to give, never made her feel like she owed him anything beyond what she freely chose to offer. "I love it here," she said finally. "I love the work, I love the people, I love the life we've built. But I'm scared too." Scared of what? Scared of getting comfortable and then having it all fall apart again. In Millbrook, I thought I had a life that would last forever, and then it was gone in a matter of months. What if the same thing happens here? Ben was quiet for a long moment. "I can't promise that bad things won't happen," he said. "But I can promise that whatever happens, you won't face it alone, not if you don't want to." Lisa realized that was all anyone could promise, not that life would be easy, but that it would be shared. She thought about the woman who'd driven away from Millbrook 3 months ago, angry and hurt and convinced that she'd lost everything that mattered. That woman had been wrong. She hadn't lost everything. She'd lost the things that weren't really hers to begin with. What she'd found here was something better, work that used her talents, a community that valued her contributions, and a man who saw her as a partner rather than a burden. "I'd like to stay," she said. "Not just temporarily, I'd like to make this my home." Ben smiled, and Lisa could see the relief in his eyes. "I was hoping you'd say that. I've got some ideas about expanding the ranch, and I could use a business partner who actually knows what she's doing." As they sat together in the growing darkness, Lisa thought about how far she'd traveled from that night when she'd cried alone on a broken car. She'd been running away from one life, but she'd accidentally run toward a better one. Sometimes she realized the best things came not from careful planning, but from the courage to keep moving forward even when you couldn't see where you were going. The ranch lights twinkled in the distance, and cattle lowed softly in the pastures. This was home now, not because it was perfect, but because it was hers by choice rather than accident. And for the first time in her life, that felt like enough.